if you're out there, Dr. Gabriel and Louisville. Okay, great. So, Dr. Gabriel and Louisville, welcome. I'd like to introduce you. You're in the SATS theological field. You were at the Ngunsung University and you've been involved in meaningful theological debates. So I'd like to hand over to you now. Feel welcome. You may begin.
Thank you so much, everybody. I think first, so good to see so many people who made their time to join us. I was just hoping for 5 people, but but it's so great to see so many who've joined us, and it's so wonderful. I just wanted to take this right back to the beginning. There you go. All right. So today, I'll be talking about the examination of Karl Barth's view of Christian ethics in light of COVID-19 pandemic in the global South. And I think before everything else, just want to trace back, kind of like the footsteps of how this whole pandemic started. So in November 2019. That's when the first case of COVID-19 was recorded in Wuhan province in China. However, of course, everything was sort of kept on the hush. And it's only until the end of December of 2019 that the WHO became aware of the case itself, which was not officially reported to it through official channels, but actually through the chatters in the local news during that time. And only later, after this time, then they approached the actual said government, which then in January of 2020, that's when China became very much open with what was happening in the country. And then the first death case, was reported in China during that time. But also, by the time the first death was recorded, the virus had already spread to some of the neighboring Asian countries. These are the people who actually were in Wuhan province during that time, which I think it's also very popular with markets and shoppings, and also churchgoers from Asia will actually go to that area for excursions and things like that. And so, in the middle of February 2020, that's when most Asian countries basically implemented some of the restrictions, the travel restrictions from those who are coming from China, and as well as the mandatory test for those entering the countries. And so currently, it's reported that the current death toll is exceeded over 6 million, going to 7 million death tolls. But of course, people who have been infected and recovered, the count is actually so much higher. So the main question, I think, during this COVID-19 was looking at the response. And basically, there are 2 kinds of responses that were very much evident. The first was what we can call the hardline responses. And these are the countries that simply went full lockdown, deploying military and police services to ensure that curfews are observed. People didn't just simply go out and do whatever they wanted. And countries like South Africa was one of those countries that it basically employed these strategies. And then you still had some countries that were they employed the neutral approach. The neutral approach basically is that you had the limited lockdowns, but at the same time, there weren't strong penalties for those who broke the laws. At the same time, these countries, they would somehow enforce the semi lockdowns within the city areas. But when it comes to the rural areas, then things were pretty much left in the open. And actually, some of the African countries, you found that actually the reports where some communities did not even know or even believe that there was such a pandemic that was going on. And so people still venture into the forest to hunt and kill the wild animals, bring them into the local what we call the wet markets to sell. And for them, the view was that um, the this pandemic was something that is something invented by the West and not necessarily something that was real. And but even the enforcement itself was lacking in those areas. So these were the two main approaches. Now, obviously, there were, let's just say, with very minor cases, for example, like Brazil and Bolivia, that went the total opposite of basically non-enforcement. But these countries are in the absolute minority. But when you talk about the majority of the world responses, these are the two main responses that we saw. Now, same thing with the Christian responses. Christian responses, this is the response from the Christian community. And we have seen sort of two main responses for this. First, you had the the full compliance response, and these are the churches that basically fully adhere to the government mandates and policies. The churches that fully complied, obviously, were within the countries that had a very strict enforcement policies. And so naturally, they would fully comply because of either the fear of the reprimand or the fear of facing the penalties of breaking the mandate, or simply because they believed that it was their duty to protect the members as well. So you had the two-sided approach to this. And also, there are also churches, for example, that had limited compliance. Limited compliance were during the initial stages of the pandemic, they would adhere to the restrictions. But as time went on and as the pandemic continued, then they would either slowly begin to resist or be very selective in what kind of mandates they would supply. For example, the Alliance of Christian Churches in Namibia, where initially they would support the lockdowns. However, they were against the mandatory vaccinations, particularly in workplaces, and they would actually try to talk to, even lobby the government, and even go into local medias to speak against such measures. So it was very interesting because um, initially, when this whole pandemic was beginning, um, I was I was sort of tempted to begin to do a research and to write while the pandemic was starting, but I sort of decided to hold back and just to see and to observe the state of affairs and how things will develop, and later then write a more of a reflective research. And so this is the approach that I took when it comes to this. And it has been quite interesting to see the different views and the different approach, particularly from Christian churches. Um, and the contrast also between the Christian churches in Africa in general versus, let's just say, the Christian response even in the US, which even over there was quite mixed. But I think largely one thing that really impressed me was just the general a consistent approach and response from the African churches when it comes to this pandemic. And I think one of the reasons is simply because Africa is not stranger to pandemics, because prior to the COVID-19, we had the situation with the Ebola pandemic. And so many countries were very much, they just said they had a working system that will enable either the state and even the churches to effectively respond, because many of the mistakes that we see happening in many of the Western countries, Africa went through that with the previous pandemic. And now when COVID then appeared, then it was simply moving into applying the lessons that were learned during the first pandemic. And that's why things, even as a whole in the continent, were much better than what was happening in the West. Even the death toll in Africa was so much lower than the United States as a whole. Now, why this research? I think, as I said earlier, first, that I was very much tempted to write during when the pandemic was starting, in order to provide specific theoretical guidelines on how the Christian community could help to navigate through the pandemic. But I then changed my mind and sort of went back to sort of a reflective. But also, it was very exploratory in the sense that looking at the source material, for example, of Karl Barth, um, initially I wasn't sure whether there was anything from his work that could even help us to formulate some kind of an ethical system. And so the initial approach was very exploratory, which, of course, with a lot of reading and research, then slowly things begin to form in place. But I think one thing that really drew me to Karl Barth was particularly his sort of divisive nature. And this came to be because of many of the conversations I had with many of the pastors, even right here, and where many from the Reformed background were very much against Karl Barth. However, when I pressed them on whether or not any of them even read any of his work, the answer was quite resounding no. So much of the opposition was simply because they were told that Karl Barth was a certain, his views were very liberal or very anti reformed. And yet, on the other side, from the liberal theologians, this side, they really didn't like him simply because he was not liberal enough. They really worship Paul Tillich, but not Karl Barth, because Karl Barth was viewed as a traitor of the liberal movement. So he was very divisive, and even with this pandemic itself was a very, very uh, very divisive as well, with how the African churches responded, and even how the Western because the West versus Africa and even Asia as well, how everyone responded to this pandemic quite differently and for various different reasons. Now, also the second is the relevance of the source material. Out of all the works that Barth wrote, I chose a public lecture that he did in 1946. Um, and so, and that's why even this particular lecture of him, which I will cover later, has very important significance of the time and date it was done, and so which I will cover a bit later on. But with Barth's background, he was born on the 10th of May in 1886, and he died on the 10th of December in 1968. And so his background as a Swiss theologian, he grew up from a Christian background. And so then his father was a professor of the New Testament studies, and his mother actually was a daughter of a pastor. And so he grew up in a very Lutheran family household. But then when he went to study theology um, in Bern and also Berlin, um, so he was very much attracted towards the liberal theology. And so that's why the works of Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche actually played a very influential role in shaping his view of theology. And but also later in 1909 to 1911, he became a vicar in Geneva, the very same church that um, that Calvin actually served. But it's also during his time that he began to sort of absorb and immerse himself again in the works of Schleiermacher and also Calvin's published works as well, both the Institute of Christian Religion and some of the commentaries that Calvin wrote. And so this began a shift because from the 1911, when he left Geneva and then he went to Safaville, he began to see how much of what he learned in liberal theology did not really translate well in the everyday existence that he saw his parishioners going through. And that's when, particularly in 1911, that's when his shift sort of began to happen. And then one of the most, can say, important, because a defining moment for him was actually in 1916 when he published his epistle to the Romans, because that was a huge shift where he moved away from the liberal theology, which did not see the necessity of the historical Jesus as to be part of a true Christian theology, to actually arguing for it, that Christ, the existence of Christ, the incarnation, and his life and ministry here plays a very vital role in Christian theology, because it's not merely about individual experience, spiritual experience, but it has to be founded on the truth of the historical Christ. And without the incarnation, then we cannot really claim that the scriptures themselves are true. And so his work on the Epistle of Romans, it severed many of his ties between himself and some of his liberal mentors, who then saw him as sort of moving into the enemy's camp, so to speak. So the source material is called Barth's public lecture entitled Christian Ethics. This was the lecture given in Frankfurt in 1946 at the Friedrich Hochstift. And this is an institution that is very prominent when it comes to, particularly in the in literature. Even today, it still exists, and it is a very, very prominent institution. This is very important because, again, of this historical significance, because during his shift, and particularly during the 1930s, when the Nazi regime was moving, the German Christian church was actually divided, because on the one hand you had the churches called which supported the Nazi regime, and this was quite it was not a small movement, but it was really big, because uh, it, it tried to draw all the different churches under the umbrella of Nazi ideology, which obviously it also meant to be anti-Semitic. The Gospels were um, were then taken away. Paul's epistles were pretty much taken away because of the Jewish connection, and instead you had the Nazi ideology moving into the churches to form this new anti-Semitic theology, and which supported the Aryan uh, view of the Nazism. And this causes a big shift. So when the war ended, the German churches was pretty much divided, and so this lecture on Christian ethics, it became very, very instrumental in laying down the framework of what Christian ethics will be for much of the German um, church, and to try to unify the Christian church, the German Christian church, to move into the new era post-war. But also the layout and the tone itself, it it explains much of Bau's theology and how his approach of theology and ethics um, could easily be understood by both the layperson as well as academics alike. And so that's why I chose this particular source material. So he begins by defining Christian ethics. And he defines Christian ethics as the attempt to give, we can say, such an answer in the spirit of those who confess themselves as Christian and more or less seriously wish to be Christian. And of course, then the question is, what answer does Christian ethics attempt to answer? And it's actually a basic question of what is the good and evil. And continues by saying Christian ethics is still an attempt to give a human answer to this question of what is good. However, its answer is not part of the range of answers people can and do habitually give based on what they think is rational or conscious, or their knowledge of nature and history. Christian ethics is an answer to a singularity, precise sense of the term. It answers the call that God has sent, sends, and will send to humanity. What is good or human has been told to you. That's Micah 6:8. Christian ethics is the attempt to repeat what has been told to humanity, to echo in human words and concepts the divine command. So basically, what this means is that when to understand Christian ethics, you have to understand, first of all, its quest to try to answer the question of what is the good. But the concept of good and evil is not something that is merely philosophical, but it comes from what has already been revealed. So it does not try to figure something that is new, that doesn't exist, but rather to understand what has been revealed by God to mankind, and simply to um, align the actions according to the divine command, according to the revelation that God has given to mankind. And so this is very important because then it sets two things. Because even going back, it's this first quotation, what it does is it sets a limitation because it shows the nature of Christian ethics as coming from the Christian revelation, helping Christians to navigate through this life, but also the limitation is a focus on the Christian community, and also it says more or less seriously those who wish to be Christian, what he considers to be the seekers. And so what he's saying now basically is the whole concept that when it comes to Christian ethics, it focuses on the Christians. And so those who do not identify with Christianity, it is quite illogical for them, for us to expect that they will simply align their actions with the revelation of Christ because they do not adhere to it. However, Christians are the ones that need to focus our actions and our thoughts based on what has already been revealed, and not try to figure out things that do not exist already. And so now comes the definition of then how then do we define what is good? And the good in the Christian sense is that behavior and action of people which corresponds to the behavior and action of God in this history. And it goes on to say the good in the Christian sense is that behavior of people in which they allow the justice of the claim that they are in need of this divine compassion, and not merely in need of it, but also partakers of it. To put in a single word, good is that action of people in which they are thankful for God's grace. And so, so basically, the whole thing is that the actions has to, what we consider to be good actions, they always have to correspond with the grace of God. Of course, the grace of God is that also which has been revealed on earth. It's not something that has to be tried to be figured out or to try to be pursued, but rather it has been revealed, and it has been revealed in this history, and that is through the incarnation, through the person of Christ, and not merely when it comes to how each individual may view spirituality. Now, then, that means also evil itself, in a Christian sense, is the behavior and action of people in which they contradict the content and action of God's history, in which, with boldness and or stealth, they bypass the suffering of the joy of Jesus Christ. Evil is that action of people in which, openly or secretly, from anxiety or arrogance, a person is unthankful. Wow. So, I mean, even just considering this, when we think of our actions, even when it comes to how we then define good and evil, the center of the definition of good and evil is the grace of God. And the grace of God revealed through Jesus Christ. And so, if our actions then align themselves with the grace of God, and even promote the grace of God, and uplift it, then that is what we would consider a good conduct or good actions. The opposite of actions that contradict the grace of God. And it says again, whether be we can say conscious or unconscious, whether we be through a sense of arrogance or ignorance. So both um, basically they're all on the same level because it is an action that that if it contradicts what has been revealed by Christ, then that is an evil action. And so then comes then the end goal of Christian ethics, which he says that people can never be means to an end for Christian ethics. Of course, then he talks about, he says here, Immanuel Kant spoke like a Christian, but only ends in themselves. It says humanity is the final goal of Christian ethics. So, in other words, it's saying that Christian ethics, the aim is for human beings. It is to help, to uplift, and also it is for the good of human beings and the value of human life. And basically he qualifies this with the very fact that Jesus himself came into this world as a human being. So all actions in Christian, because all systems in Christian ethics and all actions that are viewed to be good, even though, yes, first they have to align themselves with the revealed word of God, but also they need to be able to have a positive effect on the value of human life. And so that means then if you have sort of a hypothetical situation here, that if you are in a burning building and you have to save somehow either a puppy or even a person who may be deemed as one of the most evil, for example, Adolf Hitler, and you have to a choice to save one or the other, then the end goal when it comes to Christian ethics is to save human life and nothing else, which is sometimes it is quite difficult to swallow. However, the whole point of this is simply that even a person who may be evil can be redeemed. And so the focus of Christian ethics is for the good of human life and to uphold the value of human life. And so when it comes to human condition, yes, when it comes to it is true that Christian ethics is not optimistic. It sees humanity as it is, astray, judged, lost. So it does acknowledge that human beings are falling beings, that human beings are, after all, judged because of our sinful condition. However, it's also not pessimistic in that it does not view that human beings are lost and it does not matter what we do. There is no hope at all. But if anything, it's quite the opposite, is that it does give hope, because there is hope, because it focuses on the goodness, the grace of God revealed through Jesus Christ. And I'm just checking the time. And so then in terms of responding to human conditions, and it says, read this, so we really do live because it is true that God has established God's self as being in our favor. And that means hope for everyone, for ourselves and for others. And I think the very fact that Christ came for human beings, Christ came to save mankind, there is hope. And so when you have Christian ethics that is grounded in that truth, then it is a worldview, and it is possible to create systems that gives hope even in the midst of situations that may seem very dire and very dark indeed, like the pandemics. All right, so just quick summary of the main point. It's simply this: Christian ethics is the attempt to give the answer to the question of what is good and evil from a Christian perspective. And Christian ethics is founded on the revelation of God through the person of Jesus Christ in history. And good and evil are defined by the adherence to the grace of Christ. And the end goal of Christian ethics is the redemption of fallen human beings. So this is the summary of Barth's view when it comes to Christian ethics. And from here, the question then is, then how can we derive and come up with the system that is applicable also to the situation in the global south, particularly during pandemics? So I think the first thing is looking at the structure then of an ethical system, which is based on Karl Barth's views. The first is that is the biblical revelation is the foundation of all ethical decisions and must be based on the nature and character of the revealed Christ. So if anything, that is the fundamental truth, that whatever system or whatever worldview is, and it's then uh, drafted, it has to have that strong foundation of biblical revelation through Christ. Without that, then the foundation itself will falter. The second is that that it must focus on upholding and defending the value of human life. So whatever system it can be drafted, whatever actions can be encouraged, those has to focus on upholding and defending of human life. If not, then it loses its particular value. The second also encourages action that will draw people towards the grace of Christ. So when you have these three main points from Barth, then it's easier, then we can see of how we can then derive a sort of a practical system in Christian ethics. And so then particularly when drafting, for example, things like policies in a pandemic, particularly in our context, then the first and most important point is the pursuit and the revelation of truth. This means then that the first and foremost, whenever there is, let's just say, a pandemic or anything, for example, in a COVID-19 situation, the first step is we need to find out truth. The concept of pursuit of truth should be, if anything, the front and center of how we're going to deal with these kind of situations, which means then that it is the responsibility of the Christian community to ensure that proper information is then sought out and also revealed as well, and revealed to the Christian community as a whole and also society at large. And this is very important because then it points out on us being careful of misinformation and simply pick and choosing whatever information and that is out there that either will suit us or suit, let's just say, a particular agenda. Because then truth itself, it has to be based on a sense of reality. It has to correspond with reality. And without that bottom basis, then whatever happens will be lost. The second is that then the system or the policies that will derive then have to have must be actions, the best possible actions then to save human lives. Now, I think when it comes to this issue, then um, it does come up with a lot of questions. One of the big questions, however, it's a question of, for example, if you look at the pandemic, um, should churches at early on close or should they then open? And I think before when we that's the study I think that Sean was talking about the psychological effect on of the COVID-19 on some of the people, because then in terms of saving human life, the question, for example, would be if churches then were to close um, very quickly, how will that also affect then the psychological part? Or is it just a matter of being careful against the transmission of the action of the viruses, to try to again save human life? So in terms of saving human life and the best quality of human life, that is a I think very good discussion on what then constitute the best action. However, because of time restraints, we're not going to sort of delve too much on that. But at least in terms of thinking of the policies itself, when it comes to the system that we looked for from Barth's view, is that then it has to we have to take the best possible action to again save human life. I think the first and foremost is the actual life itself, and then from then we can even look at the issue of the psychological health, which of course it's very important on that side. And the third point again is policies that will actually um, uh, encourage the best action to reveal and to draw people to the grace of God. This is essential because then that will mean that how the Christian community responds during the pandemics could be very attractive for people to know and to be drawn closer to the grace of God, or the Christian community could be seen as part of the problem in society. And so then that will mean that whatever actions that we do from the Christian perspective, um, we need to be able to find actions that would actually encourage people to look at the message and the gospel that we have, and to be more attractive and drawn closer to God rather than to be repelled by even the church itself, because then we have become the problem instead of being part of the solutions. So, just to reiterate, first, the pursuit and revelation of truth, which I think that's fundamental. And second, the systems that could encourage the best possible action to save human life and to uphold the value of human life during a pandemic. And the third, the best possible actions that would be that could be very, you can say, evangelistic in its nature, so that people are then drawn closer to the grace of God rather than be repelled away from the church and the message that we carry. Um, yeah, so that's why I think when it comes to the Barth's views, I think it has been quite um, a very interesting journey to see what kind of lessons that we could learn. And yeah, so I will stop here and I will make time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gabriel Lovo. Yeah, I found that really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session